Okay, we're back with another note video for you guys. This one's pretty exciting for me. We get to start talking about genetics, which is my second favorite thing to talk about after cell biology. We just got done with a lot of our cell biology, so now we're rolling into genetics. We're going to focus on the Mendelian genetics, they're called, which is the genetics that came as a result of Gregor Mendel's work. So we're just going to jump right into it. This one's going to be pretty vocab heavy, so you should have your vocab words in your notebook already. And as we go through them, you should be filling in the vocab words for the different, or I'm sorry, the definitions for the different vocab words. So let's just start right out with genetics. The definition of genetics is that it is the scientific study of heredity. And heredity is the passing of characteristics from parent to offspring. And those characteristics that are passed from parent to offspring are called traits. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk. He was born in 1822, and in the mid-1800s started doing the work that he did with garden peas. And he is kind of known as the father of genetics. His work set the foundation for modern genetics. And before his research, it was just believed that the traits that were passed from parent to offspring were passed evenly. But he found in his research that there are actual dominant and recessive alleles for genes, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit here. He used garden peas to do his work, and garden peas produce male and female sex cells that are called gametes. And for us, that would be the sperm and the egg cells. Those are our gamete cells. The rest of the cells in our body are called our somatic cells. The idea of fertilization, as you probably know, occurs when the male and female reproductive cells join and they form a zygote. And this zygote becomes part of a seed. For Mendel's research, he used true breeding peas, which means that if they were allowed to self-pollinate, they would produce offspring identical to themselves. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the same plant. And so it's basically a plant fertilizing itself, which is asexual reproduction. It's reproduction without having sex, basically. So there's no genetic variation in that. That plant will create a clone of itself, and so the offspring will be identical to the parent. Mendel studied 7 traits of pea plants, but only studied one trait at a time. For example, he would look to see how height was passed from parent to offspring. Hybrids are offspring of parents that have different forms of a trait. Since only one trait was different, the offspring are called monohybrids. And then parents versus offspring of the offspring are noted differently when you're looking at genetics. So a parental original genetic makeup is called the P1 generation, and then their offspring are referred to the F1 generation, and then the offspring of those F1 generation are called the F2 generation. So F2 generations are basically grandchildren of the parent generation. In Mendel's work, he concluded that biological inheritance is determined by factors that are passed from one generation to the next. These factors that determine your traits are called genes, and you can have different forms of genes, and these are called alleles. So different forms of genes might be a height gene. Different forms of genes could be eye color, skin color, hair texture. These are all different alleles of the same gene. The first law that came of Mendel's work is called the law of segregation. And this law shows that every organism has 2 alleles of each gene, and when gametes are produced, the alleles separate. So remember, the gametes are the sperm or egg cells. You carry 2 alleles of each gene. So for your hair color, you'll have an allele that you got from your mother and an allele that you got from your father. And when you produce your sperm or egg cells, you only give one of those alleles to that sperm or egg cell. The other allele will come from the other gamete cell that fertilizes your gamete cell. A couple of important genetic terms and concepts that you need to understand for some labs and activities that we have coming up. are phenotype versus genotype and homozygous versus heterozygous. So phenotype is the way that an organism actually looks or behaves, but their genotype is their allele combination for the genes that they carry. So looking at, well, we'll take my hair, for example, because you're looking at me on the screen right now. I've got brown hair, but both of my kids are blonde. So my phenotype is brown hair, but I must also carry a blonde hair allele for hair color, but you just don't see it because the dominant brown hair has taken over. So my phenotype is brown hair, but my genotype is probably brown hair and blonde hair genotype. If an organism is homozygous for a trait, that means that their two alleles for the trait are the same. If they're heterozygous for a trait, that means that their two traits are different. The alleles for those genes are different. So I would probably be heterozygous for hair color because although you see brown hair, my children are both blonde, which is a recessive trait, so I must carry the blonde hair allele. The last concept I want to go over with you really quick here is the second law that Gregor Mendel came up with, and that is the law of independent assortment. And that is when genes for different traits are inherited independently of each other. They are not dependent on each other. And if you look here, this is showing, the picture here shows a dihybrid cross. And we're going to get into that later on with some activities that we do, so don't worry too much about it right now. And in fact, all of these concepts we're going to dive into deeper with some activities and labs. So I just wanted to put this together for you as an intro, so you sort of start to get the vocab words down, start to get a feel for it. But I think the activities that we have coming up next will really help you solidify these fun genetic concepts.